worked out the link, so she's coming in a minute. There's a mix-up on links. She's coming.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can start. You can start.
You can start. Okay. So Heidi, let's start the recording. I guess we will slowly, introduce the talk and the speaker. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our monthly International Development and Innovation Seminar Series for 2020-2021. My name is Lorena Lombardozzi. I'm a lecturer in economics here at the Open University, and I'm convening the seminars this year. So we are very delighted to have with us today Professor Funmi Olonosikan, Dr. Moses Tofa, and Dr. David Mwambari from the African Leadership Centers of King's College in London. The panel will discuss African agency in development, diplomacy, and conflict resolution, and in particular, our African states individually and African's collective institutions, namely the African Union, are providing agency in Africa's international relations in order to move beyond dominant narratives of a self-indulgent attitude about African historical victimhood. I'll say something more about the amazing speakers we have today. Professor Funmi Olonosikan is a Vice President and Vice Principal International and Professor of Security, Leadership and Development at King's College London. She's a founding member of the African Leadership Center, which aims to build the new generation of African scholars generating cutting-edge knowledge for security and development in Africa. And she was also director of the Conflict, Security and Development Group at King's between 2003 and 2013. Prior to this, she worked in the Office of the United Nations Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict. In 2015, she was appointed by the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon as one of the 7 members of the advisory group of experts on the review of the United Nations peace-building architecture. Dr. David Mwambari is a lecturer in African security and leadership studies at the African Leadership Center. He is also a by-fellow of the Churchill College in Cambridge, and he was also there for the previous academic years between 2019 and 2020. And then we have Dr. Moses Tofa, who is a postdoctoral and visiting research fellow at the ALC Center, where he leads the research agenda on peace, society, and the state in Africa from the Nairobi office. He's also chairing the ALC University of Nairobi Institute for Development Studies postgraduate module on peace, security, and development. So this talk is being recorded and it will be available for playback after. So people who don't want to be featured can ask questions in the Q&A, in the chat box, and can ask to remain anonymous. You're being, because I can see that we are around 50 people, we are being all muted during the talk. So you can please raise your hand in case you want to ask a question. We have a Twitter account, so you can follow us at intev_OU. So I think Heidi shared the link in the chat box. And we will have a feedback form at the end of the session and will be shared with you by email by Heidi. So without further ado, I will then slowly pass the floor to David, who will start to the talk. And I will give you a hint when we'll be at around half an hour, so we can have enough time for the Q&A session. I hope that's okay, David. Thank you.
Yeah, that is fine. Yeah. Thank you very much, Lorena, for that kind introduction. Good day, everybody, wherever you are, in terms of time zones. I am going to start this conversation by introducing the volume and the major themes that the volume covers, and then I will pass on to Professor Funmi Olonosikan and Moses Tofa to continue from there, and we look forward, of course, to your questions and comments. So as first, let me say that this volume looks at African agency in development and diplomacy, and it was edited by Dr. Munyi Elijah, myself, and Dr. Alex Youngnen, when we were all based at the United States International University in Kenya. The forward by Professor Paul Zeleza is due to the fact that this came out of a series of papers presented at Toyin Falola International Conference in Nairobi in 2016. And so I want to introduce the way we are looking at African agency. So when William Brown and Sophie Harman wrote their groundbreaking book, African Agency in International Politics, they labeled their book a signal of intellectual intent to have African politics, actions, preferences, strategies, and purposes taken seriously. If the constant stream of academic and empirical interest in African agency is anything to go by, then their intentions have found enduring resonance. Interest in Africa and international relations has not only been purely political, as Brown and Herman saw it, but also theoretical, as exemplified by publications such as, in the pronunciation here is a bit tricky, Bischoff et al. Whatever the empirical veracity of African agency in global politics for the definitions and demonstrations of African agency are contested. One of the enduring results of Brown and Herman's work has been a discursive shift in looking at Africa not just as a political actor impacted on by others, but also one who creates impact. The other important work that signals a shift is Mazrui and Mazrui's work in 1978 that looked at also questions of African international relations, diplomacy, independency, and change. After this volume, we saw a decade when discussions and debates on African agency were fewer. However, Ritridge series in African politics and international relations, published by Brown and Herman's African Agency International Relations, and then the same publisher has released Africa in Global International Relations, that was edited by Paul Henry, Anning Akwesi, and Amitav, which broadly addresses the question of Africa's contribution to international theory. This series of literature started to emerge, combined by the recent in 2018 when Beth Whitaker and John Clark's Africa's International Relations was also released by Lineage Publishers. And so in terms of literature, this book, this edited volume, contributes to this discursive and empirical demonstration of African agency and international politics. The book documents aspects of African states and non-state actors' agency, both collectively and individually, in conflict resolution, diplomacy, and development by asking two questions. First, the volume asks, what are the manifestations of African agency in international relations in the past decade? And this includes discussions of the influence of African states, of Paris climate negotiations, Tokyo International Conference on African Development, and others. The second question it asks is how African agency influences Africa's structural and relational power. And here we are looking at international relations as with any form of relationship that cannot preclude the role played by other actors in international sphere. So as such, we are appreciating the relation nature of agency. The book does not seek to diminish the role of other actors in African international relations, not embellish African agency. And here we are looking at International Criminal Court and other works that touch on those on different themes. And so as such, the volume collective and all the chapters can be looked at in three ways: agency as institutionalized or deepening of identity and actorness, agency as creativity and initiative in international behavior and norm development, agency as influence, okay? And so the volume is divided into two parts, which is state agency and non-state agency. The other issue to highlight that is very important is that this is a volume of majority African-based scholars, both men and women, and also one that brings senior scholars who are based in Africa, but also in the diaspora, even though they are the minority, but it brings out a generation discussion. And this is very important, as Ndlovu, Gishen, and others have signaled, we are in epistemic crisis on knowledge production on Africa. And one of those recognition that is being argued by many scholars is the importance of voices and perspectives from African context when we study Africa. And so that's something else I wanted to signal as an important contribution to bring out these voices, young scholars, to international scholarship. And so I want now to pass on Professor Fumi Olunishakin to engage with the concept of African agency. Professor Olunishakin.
Yeah, yes, here we are. Very good. Hello, Professor. We're really glad you made it.
You're
yeah, trying to attend to it.
We can hear you now.
Can you?
Yes. We can also see you now. Not now. We could hear you.
Now?
Great. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Lorena. Thank you, David. Let me first and foremost say how sorry I am. I thought I had so efficiently managed my diary and separated this, hour for this event, not realizing I was separating the hours of 13:30 to 15:30. I'm sorry about that, but I think we're right on point. I want to thank you, Lorena and colleagues, for making this meeting happen, because I think it is an agenda whose time has come and it needs to be engaged intellectually, academically, and practically. And I think we've always done one or the other. And so in making my intervention, David, this book has given us an opportunity to really, really challenge very seriously some of the traditional ways of looking at Africa and looking at the question of agency, not to talk of African agency. And I want to, in the next 10 or so minutes, just really shape this intervention in three ways. I have heard and have read, and you might have read what David is talking about in terms of these new voices when it comes to talking about African agency. But let's really look at the canker we're dealing with when it comes to contesting the traditional ways of thinking about agency. And I want to pay tribute to academics that have tried to do some of this work before. The argument here, and the one that Moses and I try to advance in our chapter in the book, is that we need to look beyond these traditional ways and actually also dare to look beyond the whole notion of statehood as it was handed down to African states or African peoples. If we want to look at the question of African agency that has impact beyond Africa. And that also we need to look at things that are not neatly defined, because in the not neatly defined, in the in-between spaces of state and society, in the in-between spaces of generations will be where you find some of the most persuasive ideas and actions of African agency. And if we were to do that, I would like to take you to the people we referenced in the book, because it's good to do justice to colleagues outside of Africa who have been pushing some of these boundaries for some time. I think the book does that well all through. What David talks about, what he was talking about just now, was well done in the book. But we're saying that, in part, what constitutes African agency lies in the emergent ideas and actions that are challenging the conventional way of analyzing and understanding Africa and international relations. So what you see in the volume is that it conceives of agency, if you like, as the ability or the capability, if you like, of agents to generate, institutionalize, and project norms to influence policies and decisions in the international space. David talked about that, and that means for Africans looking at those influences beyond Africa. So if you look at Brown's work in 2012, he talks about agency, which needs to be seen as both creative and reproductive of existing structural relationships, as well as potentially at least transformative of them. All right, and so, but when we analyze the African context, it's important, therefore, to move away from the traditional ways of conceptualizing agency. In IR, it looks really almost squarely at the idea of the nation state. As David was saying, the collection of states can begin to exercise agency in particular ways, and they have done so on the African continent. And that's because the classical approach to the analysis of agency tends to talk about how external actors and events impact Africa. And that's what we see a lot in the literature. And I think Beswick, a good colleague of ours, and Hammerstead have referenced this a lot in their work in 2013 as well, that it remains the case that international relations scholarship on Africa tends to concern itself with the way in which the marginalized, the poor, and weak African countries are acted and impacted upon by the great powers and the international institutions. So, in other words, we look at what is done to Africa, and that's the space of agency when we look at, so others invariably have agency in relation to Africa because we focus on what has been done to Africa, not what Africa does to itself and probably also to others. And that's what I'd like us to focus on this question of agency and the appropriation of African agency. So Moses and I suggest in our chapter, and as we will do this afternoon, as I'm doing now, that African agency is in abundance, has always been in international relations and elsewhere, and in economics, in trade, in every facet of life. But it has never been visible to anyone because agency is conceptualized narrowly, and if you like, it's conceptualized to the advantage of the powerful global northern actors. Let's leave that, let's park that aside, but also because agency has been so shackled in this realm of a particular idea of international relations that does not see people below the state. And why is it? Why must we construct African agency differently? I want to give you the two reasons. One, because Africa itself in international relations terms, in terms of how we see the modern state, is not the product of Africans in the state terms. The idea of statehood and IR is owned by those who colonized, and they colonized completely this idea of statehood, the armed forces that make it, and the way in which you exercise, if you like, agency as a state was not the construction of Africans, and post-independence, we did not have any chance to repair it because you also had co-opted elite who thought of African agency, who thought they needed to be like this, the preeminent northern or western actors in order to come across like they are viable states or representatives of viable states. So that's one element of it, but the power struggle is the second element of it, that power struggle manifests itself completely in the claiming of African and African resources. So if you look at outside of IR, you see how rubber comes from Africa as a natural resource. It gets into Europe, it's converted into tire, and then it's sold back to Africans at exorbitant prices that they would never be able to afford. You see how alluvial gold or diamond leaves Africa, it comes into Belgium, it might even go into, what do you call this place, around Chancery Lane. It's converted across the world into beautiful jewelry, which we all wear, regrettably, and buy and purchase in high, at high cost. And therefore, the economy remains the same. The potential, the destiny of Africans just remains shackled in that kind of system that doesn't privilege them. What does agency look like today? And I have 2 points. A penultimate point is agency in Africa today challenges the very core of this idea of the agency of state actors in IR. It looks like this. One, a group of states saying certain norms do not really conform with the realities of the continent. And that could only happen after the Cold War, in which the continent seizes its own opportunity to say, we are just really beset by this civil wars that are not abating. That's what you found in 89 in Liberia, in 90 or 91 in Sierra Leone. You saw Rwanda afterwards. You saw 91 in Somalia. Across the continent, awash with civil wars because the Cold War structures had changed for a new structure. And therefore, norms like non-intervention just did not really cut it anymore. The idea that you will not intervene in Liberia where people were dying in large numbers, or in Sierra Leone or anywhere else on the continent. So you had to change because you were responding to real life issues. And that's how Africa became of age when it came to agency. As a group of states in ECOWAS, later on in African Union in 2000 and 2002, with the NEPAD peer review, with the Constitutive Act, but ECOWAS in West Africa, responding to its conflicts, started that chain in which you had to intervene in member states to save lives and also to construct a new way of working as a group of states. Moses will talk about the appropriation elements, but the second form, which which is my last example, has to do with African citizens voting with their feet in large numbers. So ECOMOG that we saw in West Africa as a group of states within ECOWAS, AU later with its Constitutive Act that it says we can intervene in member states under certain conditions, is one form. But citizens who are saying it's not okay for us to be excluded, underprivileged, uneducated on the African continent, we can move elsewhere and search for better life. Moving across the Mediterranean, dying on the high seas in large numbers, began to impact Europe differently. So the ECOWAS-ECOMOG thing impacted Europe because nobody could ignore the fact that limbs were being amputated in Liberia and Sierra Leone, in Sierra Leone in particular. But the individuals in large numbers who are migrating by this volume, by the way, the greatest migration is still on the African continent, really, really. That's where it happens. But then we have citizens who are saying no more to their governments, but who are knocking on the doors of Europe and impacting Europe and getting Europe to actually make new immigration laws. If that isn't agency, what is it? But what's the crux of this book is that Europe and the rest of the world, the Western world, the Northern world, still go and appropriate that agency and call it their own when they see a group of states behave in a particular way, when they see citizens exercise their freedom to live and live well in particular ways. I want to hand over to Moses to give us these sorts of ways in which agency has been appropriated in Africa. I think I took far longer than the time that was allotted to me. I hope, I think I overran it by a couple of minutes. I hope we can, save some of that time back. But Moses, over to you to talk about the appropriation of African agency, which is the crux of our chapter.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been great. Just like to say that if you can, Moses, make it like 10 minutes.
All right, thank you, Lorena. Thank you, Professor Fumi. I will try to be as brief as possible, picking from where Professor Fumi has left. Now, I'm going to use the example of the responsibility to protect norm in order to demonstrate the evidence of the appropriation of African agency in international relations. I do not want to go into, the question is that it is impossible, it is difficult and even insincere to talk about the evolution of the responsibility to protect norm without talking about the role of ECOWAS interventions in Liberia and Sierra Leone in the 1990s. And, R2P is actually one of those globally acknowledged and recognized norms which clearly demonstrate the presence of African agency in international relations. So while the intervention by ECOWAS in Liberia remained controversial, because at that time the question of intervening in a particular state in order to avert a humanitarian crisis was very controversial because of the norm of non-intervention in the internal affairs of other states. But ECOWAS, shaped that particular debate through its interventions. And it is very important to, acknowledge that. But if you look at the debate from humanitarian intervention to the responsibility to protect, despite that, these interventions played an important role, and not only interventions, but the African Union is also a policy change in terms of Article 4 of the Constitutive Act, which allowed African Union to intervene in the affairs of member states in cases of humanitarian situations. So there is no doubt that R2P originated in Africa, particularly with those interventions in Liberia and Sierra Leone. But if you now look at the debate of, the conceptualization, the institutionalization of this particular debate of R2P, you can, from the late 1990s, this debate intensified, and in 2000, in his Millennium Report, the then United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan asked the famous question that if states cannot intervene in another state in order to avert a humanitarian situation, how do we respond to situations which took place in Rwanda? How do we respond to gross and systematic violations of human rights? And this witnessed the ascendancy of this idea even at the level of the United Nations itself. But I'm not going to take a step-by-step, analysis of how this debate got to the attention of the United Nations. But if you look at that process, you realize that African agency, as far as R2P is concerned, was appropriated primarily in two ways. The first question is that the participation of Africa in this debate was marginal. Africa was on the periphery of this debate. It was Canada and some leading foundations which actually took a leading role in trying to benchmark the legal, moral, operational, and political questions of R2P and conducted, consultations and produced a report. And from that report, then we saw the United Nations institutionalizing R2P in many ways. But in that process, Africa's participation was marginal. Not only that Africa's participation was marginal, but there is no recognition, there is no acknowledgement of the role that Africa played, particularly the interventions by ECOWAS in the 1990s and the policy change in the African Union. There is no acknowledgement in respect of that. If you look at that report and the processes, the focus is on how NATO's intervention in Kosovo shaped that particular debate, and even debunking the intervention of ECOWAS because it was not expressly authorized by the United Nations Security Council. So this is how this appropriation, the repackaging of humanitarian intervention to become a norm which is globally recognized. And of course, in 2011, the United Nations NATO's intervention in Libya on grounds of, so the question here is that R2P originated from within Africa, but the process of benchmarking the legal, the moral, the operational, and the political questions of R2P excluded Africa and did not acknowledge, the role of Africa in the evolution of this concept. Let me leave it here for questions.
Perfect timing, actually. You've been very efficient, time efficient. So yes, thank you very much. That was an amazing round of inputs. If you all agree, David, should we start, give the floor to the participants we have with us? We're reaching 50 participants, so I guess there will be a lot of questions. So we'll gather like maybe 2-3 questions for now, and then we'll give the floor back to the panel, and then we'll gather more. So I can see already Les. Yes, Les, do you want to mute yourself?
Okay, yes, thanks for the presentations. I want to ask how you see your version of African agency relating to concepts of neocolonialism and means to resist or overcome the neocolonial order which dominates Africa today.
Thank you, Les. Les, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Oh yeah, I'm in DPP, Development Policy and Practice, like many others who are attending.
Yeah, we are attending. So, any other comments or questions? I have a question, if you don't mind. I was thinking, I mean, I think I'm one of the few economists here. And when you talk about agency from an institutionalist perspective, I always think about structure, right? And you mentioned the fact that, I mean, the obvious reality, the materiality of, you know, like of economic systems as being, I mean, historically overwhelmed with African resources. You mentioned like diamonds, but I mean, if you think about agriculture, everything is basically, we rely on African resources. So because I'm an economist and I'm not an IAR expert, when you discuss, like, I mean, and I guess it makes complete sense, this idea of narrowing, like the critique of the narrow understanding of what is statehood and what is a state agency in a context of, you know, like global justice. How do you like relate this to the structural of capitalism and global economic system nowadays? So in a more like material sense, what would have been like the most important, you know, like revendication from a structural point of view? I don't know. I think people have to like digest all these thoughts. So maybe you can reply to these two, and then we'll have a second round.
Do I need to raise my hand before I ask the question?
Is it? Who is it? Who is talking?
My name is Clement.
Yeah, Clement, go ahead. Yes, it would be, the protocol is basically to raise hands so that I can give the floor. But yes, please, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Just a quick question. I mean, I think the whole conversation is very fascinating and interesting, looking at African agency in the world. And I mean, you don't need to look far to know that there's been some influence. But my question, though, is, have we seen, you know, positive dimensions of where African agency comes to play in the world affairs, rather than looking at so I mean, if I pick one example of how you know, the influx of migrants from Africa to Europe, for instance, led Europeans to tighten their border, you know, homeland security and stuff, to make things difficult for people to come in. I'm wondering where, you know, so in that extent, we say yes, the agency cannot exclusively be attributable to the Westerners. But are there positive dimensions of these kinds of conversation? For instance, has there been occasions where Africans have led something? Because I read a book somewhere, maybe one example, but I want to see whether there are other examples. Africans were very instrumental in the formulation of the 1948 Human Rights Declaration, because of, you know, the advocacy around human rights for Africans, and then became a global thing. Are there other examples of those ones, rather than looking at it as Africans always, you know, being on the right side of history and Europeans being reactionary in response to Africans' agency in that light?
Can I take a stab, Lorena?
Yes.
First of all, I just want to say thanks to colleagues for those questions, because in a sense, this is exactly what we're hoping for, to have a conversation around, what constitutes agency. And I think Clement's questions around, have we seen positive dimensions of where African agency comes to play? And of course, the issue of, let me start from the back and I'll walk my way very quickly. The issue of what's positive or negative, what you see and what you feel and your perception of things depends on where you stand. But I get you. I think Clement, you and I stand in the same place when we think about the positivity and the negativity of all of this. If you take the human rights regime that you talked about, Africa's contribution is huge on issues of group rights, all right? When you think of group rights, the idea that, it's not just the rights of individuals you have to really think of and protect. African, writers, but also activists have done a lot of work in that area. This is what's come in terms of African contributions to the Convention of, discrimination in all its forms, what we call the Women's Convention on CEDAW. This is what we have seen in how we begin to look at how to protect group rights. This is what led to the African Human and People's Rights, the whole notion of people's rights as well. So there, we have a lot of evidence. And I think the point we're trying to allude to in this chapter, maybe David can reflect on the whole book as a whole, is that where you have such positivity, it is always claimed as non-African. But where you have the negativity, it suddenly becomes African. There are two things to look at, very much so, the contribution to the existing norms when those norms are changing. So Moses talked about responsibility to protect. That itself would have been a positive contribution of African agency if its origins were acknowledged, if the processes that led to the Commission's work and what became R2P were acknowledged appropriately. But you can then go into the area of economy. Lorena was talking about it's also the acknowledgement of the need to collaborate with the owners of the resources, the origins of the resources. So when you really look at the global capitalist system, nations that exercise their agency have found ways to exercise that agency and take of that system what they may. This is what China is doing. And there's a lot of work in that area. It might not look like capitalism. We've had this debate elsewhere. But you see how nations that can exercise agency do with the world systems what they may. But when actually we cannot research our natural resources, we can't research the conversion of uranium to other things, we cannot even research and have the facilities to do so in those countries. And that's an appropriation going on there. When the history of Africa, the art of Africa, it's, all of those things that represent its history and its spiritual life and all of, when they're carted into museums in Europe, that is appropriation of agency. We cannot even teach with those things on the continent. So it reflects across the board. I'm not an economist myself. It's an experiential thing that I talk about in the whole question of that agency. If I now come to the third aspect of it, which is a question, excellent question as well, like the other two, how do we see our version of African agency in relation to, neocolonialism and attempt to resist the kind of domination that we're talking about? It's related. It's related. The difference this time is that, people are not just writing it. People are doing it. And for the first time, we're connecting the doing and the writing. And that's why you can then begin to see how scholars in the Western world who are on the side of this form of African agency, who have been pushing those boundaries, can begin to work with scholars like David and Co., who produced this book, and many more, to begin to rewrite the narrative very strongly. But we need to look at Africa as it is empirically, not as it ought to be. For far too long, we have looked at Africa as it ought to be. It ought to be this kind of state, have agency in this way. And when we don't see that Africa replicated in our own worldview, Western worldview, we think there's no agency, but we even rob it of the limited agency that we think it has. That's the point that we're trying to make in this book.
Yeah, thank you. Lorena, it's okay if I will combine to reflect on, thank you for all those, fantastic questions. I think I'll combine two questions, Les and Lorena, and then reflect briefly on Clemens. I think in terms of this particular volume, we have chapters that are bringing out the African voices also without necessarily addressing the state, non-state actors. We have a chapter, for instance, on Sudan that is talking about the resistance of these neo-colonial rulers, or if you want, collaborators, and how women in that movement led. So you have examples of ideas that are showing how people resist this neo-colonial order that, as you put it, dominates Africa today. But also, that question is very important because the thinking of African agency from within, and how Professor Fulman says, how Africa is rather than how it ought to be, itself has to do with noticing, writing, and studying processes that are ongoing that resist this neocolonialism. It is not that the literature sometimes we have representing, it is not as if neocolonialism exists and there has been resisting neocolonialism has sort of ended. No, African young people are actually engaged in activism. They are engaged in processes, political processes, movements, demonstrations that actually seek to resist this neocolonialism. And the accent, though we don't cover all the context and all the case studies, but we want to signal a turn to think about this, to take seriously these movements and these actions by African young people that are usually left out of literature just because of sometimes they are considered as informal. But resisting neocolonialism exists in many different forms. So we also want to encourage, this volume also want to encourage this kind of scholarship that looks at the people from, as Dr. Tova said, from the margins, and letting them, their lives and their expressions of what they believe and what they want to resist as a reality. Also to build on Professor Fumi's point about this shift between the writing on and the doing, especially touching on the political economy. Recently, I think many people online that I can guess at least see online, but I'm sure offline as well, were amazed by the announcement by the Ghanaian president when he was in Switzerland, and he declared in diplomacy with a very good diplomatic tone that Ghana would prefer not to send out cocoa and gold to Switzerland, to Switzerland companies, but rather produce it. And I have been to Ghana a few years ago, and the chocolates, are now Ghanaian because exactly this neo-colonial political economy, in a way, political leaders in Africa are starting to see that they have to resist it. Why is it that we have to be acquainted that produces raw materials for others when we can build the same factories back home and also have that ownership, and also, as Professor Oneshakin said, that benefits the owners of those raw materials, rather than always studying, even though that's very important, how it occurs to have these minerals. And so I want to say that speech is one of them, that even political leaders, political elites are starting to see that and doing rather than even just writing. And so again, this scholarship is very important because then it can lead to new ways of doing business by producing your own finished products. Then it allows African countries either independently or in a collective to assert their agency in diplomatic relations. Here I was giving an example of bilateral relations. And we see that happen in the Francophone Afrique. For a long time, discussions of the CFA, if I'm pronouncing correctly in English, have been on the margins. If you look at the political conversations going on, even the French media, it's astonishing that now there are even political attempts to reshape and reconfigure how the CFR works. And this was yesterday, not even 5 years ago, was a conversation for activists. The name escapes me of this particular activist who was talking about it. Examples are many in the political economy. Recently in Senegal, we saw protests of young people expressing their frustration about a particular politician, but it led very quickly to the destruction and sort of expression of anger against French economy, French business interests. And that caught the French media, it caught the French elites. This is African young people, unfortunately, through means of violence, but expressing their agency across the border. Of course, factors like the internet help. They are introducing a whole new dimension of looking at things. And they make those kind of ideas travel quickly. And so, we have to see the African continent for what it is and what is going on. Myriad reminds me that the activist I'm referring to is Kemi Seba, who was really very much, his activism was very much on the periphery. And so the CFA has now been transformed into a new currency that is yet to take shape. But there is a lot of discussions going on how African economies will organize around that within looking at their own interests. So I think this is a very exciting moment to have this volume introduced. It by no means covers all. It just signals a turn and contributes to other scholarship that we allude to, of even colleagues from outside the African continent. Thank you, I'll pass on to Dr. I will reflect on Clement's question later because I've taken long.
Yeah, Moses, do you want to add more?
No, I think it has been exhausted. Maybe we can take another round of questions. Yeah.
All right. Okay. But yeah, feel free to intervene. We have Bukola. Yes? Do you want to unmute yourself, Bukola? And introduce yourself quickly?
Yes. Okay. Hi, Lorena. My name is Bukola. I am a doctoral student in international development and education. I have a sort of a curious question, and in some ways, some of your responses picked up on this earlier, but particularly in relation to the RTP, to what extent were there epistemic or epistemological origins to that demonstration of agency? So when you talk about RTP, I'm hearing echoes of Ubuntu and other sort of African communitarian values, which are very strongly about group rights and protection of people and so maintaining social cohesion and social harmony. So when you speak about ECOWAS's efforts around RTP, were those underpinned in some ways by some of these more communitarian values? And then to what extent, if you have other examples of demonstration of agency, to what extent do you think those are also, underpinned by these more socialist or communitarian African values?
Thank you. And then we have Emmanuel.
Yes.
Hi.
Emmanuel. Hi. Thanks everyone, and thanks for the invite as well. I thought it's quite a good presentation, and also it does address some of the issues that confront Africa. Whether we blame the colonial masters as or we move away from there. I think it's almost 70 years now, or some countries 60 years now, or 50 years that we talk about colonization and the economy. But I think specifically with the professor, she has laid down some ground argument in terms of the agency. However, I've all been born in Africa, grew in Africa, and then got educated in the UK. I just find that sometimes there is two aspects of it. Africa is prone to be, or our leaders is prone to be, what I call the self-destruction and destitute. That's one of the elements of the way we have to see this economic colonization, capitalism, resources, and lack of development in Africa. That's another side of it. So it means that some of the problem that we are discussing today has its root cause in the behaviors of the African people and leaders. That is that also comes from the development of the colonization purpose for economics and things like that. So my question to the professor, how do you address this issue fundamentally that hit the core of our economic development, when you have leaders with short sight and also people who are prepared to sign bilateral treaty that is detriment to the country? How do you change this to ensure that the development of Africa rise in future?
Thank you, Emmanuel. Just to introduce yourself, you are lecturing law at the OU, right?
Yes, I am. Oh, sorry, I didn't introduce myself.
Yes. All right. Is there anyone wants to ask some questions? Otherwise, we will go back to the panelists to reply to this.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I couldn't see. Is there a question on the chat? Because I cannot. Yeah, I mean, can you read the chat?
Yes. Shuvai Nyoni, would you say there is concurrent resistance from the West to acknowledge the empirical evidence that contradicts existing norms? What is at stake if existing global norms are found to be insufficient to explain or provide solution for what is happening in reality? What will it take for a groundswell of policy action to assert these evidence-based norms?
So maybe you want to start answering those three?
Well, I'll mention a few things very quickly and allow especially Moses to deal with the R2P question.
Okay.
But I just wanted to address very quickly, Emmanuel, there are really new opportunities even to engage in the most difficult conversation in bilateral diplomacy. Recently, Kenya applied for a new International Monetary Fund loan, and the citizens, or you call them net citizens, who had observed how Kenyan economy has been crippled by corruption and how recent funds from COVID relief were very quickly shared amongst political elites and business elites, decided to have an online forum, I think it's change.org, change.com, to tell IMF that Kenya does not need a new loan. I mean, this for me is very exciting, because before we really learned about loans, about bilateral relationships, about policies that have been taken when the signatures were already there and the journalist was reporting, at least in my experience, that this country and this country have signed a particular agreement. So this is why we need to look at citizens and net citizens' expression of agency also. Because in this particular space, whether IMF gives a loan to Kenya or not, there is a new trend now to ask questions on a kind of diplomacy that has been hidden previously. And this is very important, because bilateral relationships and bilateral diplomacy hides a lot of policies and rules that go unchallenged just because of the, if I want to say, the hidden parts of diplomacy and how they unfold in particular spaces at the United Nations or in embassies that sometimes African peoples are not welcome to scrutinize or even to understand. But we see, I see for me an online space as a new place that might shape the conversation. And this goes to Shuvai Nyoni's question as well about the norms and the resistance of the West. Of course, I think policymakers in the Western countries, some of them intentionally, others unintentionally, want also to protect their own interests. At the European Union, we have a very difficult conversation going on between East African countries and the European Union as they discuss a new policy of cooperation, to the point where diplomats have had to go to country by country. Many years ago, I think not even a decade, 2 decades ago, these bilateral relations were mostly governed by European ideas and how they imagine those relationships going. But we see a new shift where also African diplomats understand the needs of their people, or understand how they can bargain collectively to disrupt these so-called global norms of diplomacy, or places where this theater where diplomacy is played, this space is being shifted. So that's how we reflect on this. Certainly, there is need for more work on this to capture, especially these new waves and these new ways we are seeing African agency demonstrating itself. Moses, please.
Thank you, David. I'll try to be brief. I'll respond to the question of to what extent does ECOWAS intervention in the 1990s a demonstration of African agency? Now, in order for you to understand how that is a demonstration of African agency, you need to be able to understand the contestations around the use of force in international relations, particularly the question of intervening in the internal affairs of given states. So there have been attempts to regulate the use of force in international relations, starting from, example, the League of Nations, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, and the United Nations Charter, particularly Article 2.4 of that charter. So the intervention in Liberia by ECOWAS, without the express authorization of the Security Council on humanitarian grounds, was groundbreaking. And it actually influenced a policy change even within the United Nations itself, because then the United Nations imposed an arms embargo on Liberia and authorized ECOWAS to enforce that arms embargo. And it deployed an observation mission to ECOWAS, which worked to Liberia, which worked with ECOWAS. For the first time, we had a peacekeeping mission from the United Nations working together with a regional organization, not only for the first time within the United Nations, but we also saw that change even in the respect of African Union and peace building approaches. So that is a very clear demonstration of urgency, because then it challenged the idea of non-intervention to say that if there is a humanitarian catastrophe which is unfolding in a given state, then the international community has the responsibility to protect, and ECOWAS justified its intervention on that particular ground. Let me leave this time to Professor Fumi.
Okay. I think I'm in. Can you hear me? No, I think these questions have taken us to the crux of why this work that David and colleagues edited, what they put together, which I feel really privileged to have been a part of, why that work matters a great deal. And David has spoken to this. I like Emmanuel's intervention. What is the responsibility of African elite? I think that's why it's important to really take seriously the challenge, the contestation around three sorts of terms very seriously. The state itself and what actually constitutes the sovereignty of the state. I think that's what is being challenged a great deal. A state that does not represent you, a state actually that makes you feel more insecure than normal, a state that its elite very often, not all the time, are morally bankrupt and do not represent the interests of the majority. What qualifies that state as sovereign is the big question. And why is that state, why should that state, which cannot even guarantee the monopoly of the means of violence, which is again a classical IR assumption when you look at the security studies branch of IR. I think those questions really are not things that those states have managed to answer. By the way, not even the United States, as I've said elsewhere, can claim the monopoly of the means of violence these days, but that's actually down to its own structure. These are the things that scholarship must challenge when we have seen them really emanate in practice. And that's why, Emmanuel, when you're talking about the root cause being found in the behavior of African people and their leaders, in the behavior of leaders who are an inheritance elite, who inherited state structures and apparatuses that were not created for those people, but did not also fundamentally alter the apparatus of governance. And so those states, therefore, those leaders, therefore, and I don't disagree with you, but I just want us to lay it bare conceptually what we know practically, that we cannot say, therefore, that you can really tell those leaders to have the preserve of ownership of the people of the state that they do not represent. They're part, I argue, and I think I've made this claim elsewhere, and we imply it in the chapter, that they're part of a global elite system. And it happens. And so if you're part of a global elite system where the system itself does not speak for the majority of your people, you have taken a side. And we have to see that as one of the fundamental factors that underwrites the kinds of protests and contestations we see in Africa. If we don't take that into account and we assume a state is a state and is a state, regardless of its capacity to provide for its people and meet the regular norms, global norms of statehood, then there's a problem. And I think as scholars, we need to really do some serious research in that area. The time has come to do that. It's not, so the second concept I want to take on is that of leadership. Emmanuel really triggers something around that. This is why the African Leadership Center, one of the reasons why it was created, to challenge the very conception of leadership in a way that is so person-focused and focuses on a person at the top of a vertical hierarchy that is assumed to be acting on behalf of others. We see at the African Leadership Center, we've done a lot of work around this conceptually, that leadership has to be about a collaborative practice, that where the majority, everyone, whether you are leading or you're following, and you're not always leading and not always following, you're responding to your context, to your situation, in pursuit of common goals. That's not the model of leadership that governs Africa. When you do not have decent institutions, you need to have a decent leadership framework in which the collective, that fragmentation in the leadership is why you see the young population of Africa acting in particular ways, making particular demands, and we're asking that this is agency, has to be recognized as agency, whether it is yielding positive results or negative results. You have to bring back that back into the fold of the conversations you're having. My final point, and I think Shuvai says it all, has to be about the concept of ownership. Who owns, who owns Africa and the people of Africa? If you make those demands that young people are making in Africa and other people and scholars as well, it's an interdisciplinary conversation we're having these days, not just that of IR. IR itself is interdisciplinary in some ways, but there's an archaic interdisciplinarity that needs to yield to new ways of working. That resistance from the West is all right. In traditional IR, really, it is interest that matters. And there's no state that is a permanent friend, as we've heard so many times, of another state. But there's permanent interest. And we cannot expect power to give in so easily. The ownership of Africa is contested between Western interests and African people's interests. And so when you ask that ownership to reside with only the leaders of Africa, you are actually acting against the vast majority of the people of Africa, peoples of Africa. I think let me leave it there. Thanks.
There is a question in the chat.
Yes. Now I can open the chat. Thank you. So I guess we start with Susan, who is a professor in economics here at Open University. Thanks for the very interesting and important discussions. I would be interested to know more about variations in the way that agencies are exercised across the continent, the who, the how, and the where. Do you want to maybe?
Yeah. I'm happy to do that because it relates directly. That's an awesome question, because if we're to look at the sum total of African agency, you see fragmentation. And this question itself is very, very important in that sense. there are variations in which, in how agency is exercised. What IR does, it takes the agents of the state as a given every single time, that if a leader of a particular state is speaking on behalf of that state, either in the General Assembly, UN Security Council, AU, EU, wherever they are, they speak on behalf of the people of that state. I think we've said enough in this seminar to say that there's contestation around speaking on behalf of people that you do not completely represent, because the state itself is fundamentally faulty in the way that it's been constructed. So therefore, the idea that, but having said that, are we saying that the leaders, where you have national conversations that have produced more legitimate sort of governing elite, are we saying that they cannot have agency? No, we're not saying they can't have agency. We have to see the various nuances in that, and those leaders will speak. But the argument is that they're not always exercising agency on behalf of Africans, and we need to recognize, therefore, the sites of contestation of actual agency. And therefore, when you see the informal economy in Africa, and when you see diaspora remittances, which dwarfs foreign aid more than 7 times as we understand it these days, you have to see that as a theater of agency. You have to see protests on the streets in large numbers in the forms that we've seen in Burkina Faso, Senegal, Zimbabwe, Sudan. You have to see that as massive representation of agency, and it to be sharefully not to acknowledge them. So I like these questions. This is a very important research question, actually. I'll take it with me. The who, the how, and the where. I want to thank you for that.
I was thinking about the same, that this is, Professor Paul Zelezer's forward in our volume actually looks at how this agency and the question of who, how, and where, historically, what it has meant whenever the African was a bit at the center or at the margins. And so the question you ask is really interesting, because we take it for granted that the who might be state actors. But as Professor Fumi just pointed out, is many actors. And here I want to flag that this question of African agency is so important because of where the continent is positioned, talking about Lorena's question earlier, in global economies and futures of technology. Without understanding how the Democratic Republic of Congo's wealth will shape, without asking how it will shape the future, you will miss out an important aspect of global capitalism, and you will miss out to understand who within that space of giving these raw materials to the world that is innovating very fast, who is exercising that agency. It is also the miners, the people who are in the mines, the African entrepreneurs who are constantly innovating to provide different materials or ideas that are needed. It's the diaspora. We saw recently a clash. We saw people resisting the African diaspora in China being mishandled. And many African young people, or even those who are on social media, kept on insisting that China needs Africa more than maybe we think Africa needs China. But we also see Brazil having a very clear engagement, primarily with Lusophone African countries, but also other countries. So with the Latin American countries having a policy, but most importantly, Angola or Mozambique and other countries also having their own policies that are going to express how those relationships are going to be shaped. So the who, we have to look at just many actors, not traditional Western actors that we're thinking about. The Arab states are experiencing a new ways of thinking about Africa. They are buying different companies. They are investing on the African continent. So all this interest, really, the world wants to engage with the African continent. But how do we study it? When we start looking at these questions, we start taking Africa as if it's a country. And this is denoted within how language is used, even within research. It's very almost taken for granted to say China, Africa, as if China is not a country and Africa a continent, or Brazil and Africa relationships, or, we rarely say Africa and Asia relationships, so we need to even to see how language has to change to acknowledge what the African continent is, what African peoples are in the world. Because as migrations have been taking place, African peoples have been shaping ideas. They have been shaping the world through the oldest encounters in terms of slavery, colonialism, but also good migration patterns, like those who have gone out to look for opportunities. It doesn't have to be all negative historical events that have made Africans mobile. And so these diaspora voices and peoples are very important. Today in academia, we're talking about decolonization ideas, and some people argue or present these ideas as if they just came up with them. But African intellectuals from Haiti resisting the French imperialism to Du Bois in America to many other scholars have been shaping how the world should think about human beings, across disciplines. So, I think the who, how, and where is a very diverse, very interesting question. And I was trying to touch on it to reflect on it. I think that is very diverse and very contested. Thank you.
Lorena, do you mind if I just maybe in a couple of sentences, I really underscore some of the points made by David and link that to Shuvai's last question of what will it take for a groundswell of policy action to assert these evidence-based norms? I think it's absolutely important that we get this right. And also to not be too romantic about the idea that maybe the time has come that suddenly the West will see these changes and will act differently. We shouldn't have expectation that things will suddenly change like that. It will be important to accumulate that scholarship. It will be important to challenge established frameworks so strongly through evidence and through the cumulative, actions that we see and the recording of those actions, to use them to challenge places of scholarship or policy spaces as well, and to use it to speak back to even this generation of people who are challenging, to get them to understand that you cannot challenge with just one worldview. We are in a world where technology has helped us accumulate many things in real time. And if we do not understand the nature of the actors in that space, the power dynamics that really shape the space and makes them, make that space the way it is today, we will not overcome. We will just simply be researchers that have passed by night for another set of researchers to replace us. And I think that's why the intergenerational conversations and scholarship will be so important, as we've been saying at the African Leadership Center. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Moses, do you want to add something?
Thank you. No.
Okay,
no,
we have 9 minutes left, so it's an opportunity for, it's been a very dense discussion, and I guess we've been learning from different point of views. So I was wondering whether participants has any more follow-up questions or comments on what has been discussed so far. It seems very quiet. Hello?
Yes, we hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. So, Natalie. Hi.
Hi, I am Natalie. I'm a doctoral researcher at the OU on education and I guess international relations. I am interested in. I found the discussion really interesting on leadership, representation, and agency, and it reminded me of I don't know if you came across the Kenyans on Twitter last week wrote to the IMF to ask that they stop being that the IMF stops loaning them loans because of their leadership. They're accumulating so much debt, and I guess it was mostly younger Kenyans talking about how the future might look bleak for them in terms of having to then pay back all of these loans. They cited misuse of funds that have gone on and corruption within the government over the last few years. And I'm wondering, what impact do you think that kind of agency will have on these big institutions, and whether they can dent essentially when you're talking about leadership that doesn't necessarily represent the people, and the people's maybe only voice is, you know, through social media in this way. Do you think it can have a dent on these bigger institutions essentially?
Thank you, Natalie. And we have, I think, a follow-up question from Emmanuel. If you...
Just, I have a last question, then I have to disappear, sorry, because I have a meeting.
Yeah.
This will go straight to the professor. Sorry, I'm picking on you because what you're talking about is quite fascinating. So basically, I think one of our problem in present time in terms of looking at Africa is the lack of good governance and accountability. However, when you go back to reading some of our history and the concept of ethical principle, you will find that throughout before colonization, we have a street system that has some high ethics that govern the local people. But you could look at, for example, Ghana, the Ashanti region, how they have governed their local people onto slave trade kick in, colonization kick in, and bribing the elites of the country kick in. So my question, is it a way that we could go back to study how our society used to behave before colonization and try to reinforce that ethical principle that is enshrined in our traditional rules, so that will start to govern the way we approach things? Because the Westernized approach doesn't necessarily address the issue, because fundamentally what the research from the Western institution does is far from what is happening on the ground. So how do you resolve this issue? Because in the past, we did have a good society that respect ethics before the bad times kick in and onto present days.
Can I just jump in? So Emmanuel, thank you so much for that. And I've been asked this in other ways before. My answer would be to say, leave the past to be, leave this alone as well, leave this period alone. Let's just find what the generations alive today, what are the terms on which they will live together? Many of our countries never had that conversation about the terms on which we would live together and therefore govern our lives in common. If we went back to the colonial times, some of us in gender terms would not be sitting here because I'll be second or third or fourth or fifth wife to someone. I know that's not what you mean, of course, Emmanuel, but I'm just saying we can then, once we know what it is we want, the basis on which what is it that worked in the pre-colonial times that we can take from our cultural context? What is even working at this particular moment in another country that we can borrow from? The fact is, many of us haven't had that conversation except through civil wars that did not even settle the question. And I want us to take your question as well as one of those things that we need to really have a debate around. And on Natalie's question about whether you think what's happening in the social media, my answer is yes, but it has to be consistent. There has to be, we have to do less nonsense on social media and use that space. What new media has done is to disrupt significantly. If it was not for new media, what we're talking about in terms of George Floyd's killing would not happen. If it weren't for new media, many of the protests and the contestations in Africa would not be happening the way they are. But we have to be consistent, and we also have to be substantive and to add value by actually putting evidence that works in those spaces. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Very, very quickly, I just wanted to ask that.
You're muted. I think Lorena is muted. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, just a quick round. And can I jump in on just to read the last question that we have from Tony? Interesting to bring out the Kenyan case of IMF loan facility and the ongoing petition against, as it happened in any country, and how it affected the economy of such country. Just if you have time to just have a quick reply. Yeah, we have very few minutes left, but
I'll leave David to do that. Yeah.
Two very quick interventions. One, on the question of Emmanuel, there is I'm referencing the work of Achille Mbembe and others, and Love Gishen as well has been in this space, on what it means to go back the past. I mean, one of the arguments that Achille Mbembe makes is that already colonialism happened. You know, you just can't forget it. So what you want to do is to look at the, you know, this remix, or like assemblage, as they call it in French, a mixture of things that allows you to negotiate how you shape the future. But certainly we cannot consider that almost colonialism happened, or that there was a glorious past that African communities had, and Professor Owa has given a very good example. The other issue I wanted to speak to so there is a literature on this question of going back in the past. That's what actually Mbembe is one of them. There are many scholars thinking about this question. The second issue of IMF, absolutely certainly, IMF, I just posted, had to respond and explain why. You know, this is rare in diplomacy, that they had to explain why are we giving the loans despite this protest. The people were heard. And what will be a critical question is, how does this shape the relationship of Kenya and IMF going forward, and other African countries, other African peoples and citizens who have seen this example? What does that mean in this space of diplomacy? And how who gets to influence how bilateral relationships between these big agencies and countries are decided upon? So I see that action as very important, merely by just getting a response from IMF to explain why they did this. So so I think that was agency of Kenyan peoples. But with time, thank you very much for your attention. It was really great, and I hope you engage with the volume.
Great. Do you want to add something, Moses? Oh, unmute.
Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself. Yes, I just wanted to just add briefly about that agency, that it works, and it brings the question of where is that agency coming from, and the question of the sustainability of that agency. In Zimbabwe, for example, we have had situations where opposition leaders wrote to the IMF, wrote to different financial institutions to say, do not provide loans to the government because of questions of corruption and accountability, questions of bad governance. And not only those leaders, but also, the ordinary, the citizens, putting that particular pressure. So if this is exercised from different constituents of society, and these constituents reinforce each other, and it is sustainable, that form of agency is very useful. Yes, thank you.
Great. So I'm afraid we have run out of time, but I think from the chat, and I mean from the participants, we all agree that it has been a wonderful discussion, and thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this seminar series. Thank you everybody. There is a lot of messages for you. Maybe if you want to exactly share, David, yes, you'd like the book, that would be great. And I wish you happy and nice rest of the day, and I hope to keep in touch. Maybe next year we can organize follow-up seminars on the question of agencies and variety of agencies in the African continent and beyond. I mean, I guess it's beyond Africa. All the global South, in a way, has to ask this question. So thanks again, and
Thank you.
Speak soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lorena. Thank you, everybody, for your
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.